Every border dispute you see in the modern Middle East, follow it backward. Every war fought over contested territory. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, follow it backward. Every refugee camp that has existed for 3 generations with no sign of closing. Every sectarian conflict that tears a government apart before it can govern. Every pipeline dispute. Every sanctions regime. Every proxy war. Follow any of them backward far enough and you arrive at the same place. Not a battlefield, not a religious text, not an ancient hatred. A hotel room in Belgium. A table. 5 men. A map. And 1 man with a red crayon. On July 31st, 1928, in a hotel in Ostend, Belgium, 5 men signed a secret agreement that divided every drop of oil in the former Ottoman Empire between themselves. The meeting was not announced. The agreement was not published. The population sitting above the oil had no idea it was happening. One of the 5 men drew the boundary line himself. He drew it from memory, with a red crayon, tracing the old Ottoman borders across a map of the Middle East. Everything inside that line was subject to the cartel. Everything inside that line would be developed only when the cartel decided it was profitable to develop it, at a pace the cartel controlled, at prices the cartel approved. His name was Kaluste Gulbenkian. He was an Armenian oil broker who had spent 40 years maneuvering between the competing interests of governments, banks, and oil companies, with the patience of a man who understood that the people in the room with the most leverage are rarely the ones making the loudest speeches. He had negotiated himself a permanent 5% stake in every barrel of oil ever produced from the former Ottoman Empire. 5% of everything. Forever. The other men in the room had tried for 2 decades to remove that 5%. They had failed. Gulbenkian drew the line and kept his share. The companies those 5 men represented became BP, Shell, Total, and ExxonMobil. The line he drew is still the reason the Middle East looks the way it does. This is not a story about diplomacy or religion or ancient hatreds. It is a story about oil concessions, railway contracts, and share percentages. The financial architecture that was being constructed beneath the surface of every promise made and every border drawn in the years between 1914 and 1928. The men who divided the Middle East were not primarily statesmen acting in the national interest. They were financial actors protecting investments, securing concessions, and positioning their institutions to extract value from the most oil-rich territory on earth before anyone else could stop them. Before we follow the money into those hotel rooms, this channel traces the financial mechanisms behind the events you thought you understood, the concessions, the cartels, and the balance sheets that determined how the world was divided. If that's the history you want, subscribe before we go further. The sums in this story are still running. To understand how the Middle East was divided, you have to understand how it was already owned before the division began. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Sultan could not pay his civil servants. Military officers went months without salary. Provinces that had once sent revenue to Constantinople were now sending apologies. The empire that had once stretched from Vienna to Baghdad, that had held the Muslim world together for 6 centuries, was being kept alive by loans from the same European banks that were circling it like creditors at a bankruptcy hearing. And those creditors were not waiting to be repaid. They were already helping themselves. They were already collecting at the source. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had controlled the lands we now call Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. At its height, it was among the most powerful political organizations on earth. By the 19th century, it was bankrupt. The numbers tell the story. In 1881, the Ottoman government could not service its foreign debt. Debt accumulated through decades of borrowing from European banks at ruinous interest rates to finance wars, infrastructure projects, and the administrative costs of a crumbling empire. The total Ottoman public debt by that point stood at approximately 252 million Turkish pounds. Annual revenue was not sufficient to cover the interest. The empire had borrowed itself into structural insolvency. The response of the European creditor powers was to create the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881, a body controlled by European bondholders that took direct control of the empire's major revenue streams, the salt and tobacco monopolies, the stamp duty, and the silk tithes of several provinces among them. European bankers were not waiting for the empire to die. They were already collecting at the source. Into this environment of financial desperation came the railway concessions. The most consequential was the Baghdad Railway, a German-backed project that aimed to connect Constantinople to Baghdad and ultimately to the Persian Gulf. Deutsche Bank was the primary financier. The concession, granted by the Ottoman government in exchange for cash it desperately needed, gave Deutsche Bank and its German industrial partners the right to build and operate the railway and to extract mineral resources from a strip of territory 20 kilometers on either side of the track. In Mesopotamia, that strip ran through some of the most geologically promising oil territory on Earth. The Germans were not building a railway. They were positioning themselves over an oil field. Britain and France watched this with alarm. Not because the Baghdad Railway threatened the Ottoman people. Neither power had much concern for that. But because a German-controlled railway running to the Persian Gulf threatened British naval access routes to India and French commercial interests in Syria. Railway concessions were the financial instrument through which the great powers were already staking their claims to Ottoman territory before the first shot of the First World War was fired. The railway concession system was the financial mechanism through which European banks converted Ottoman debt into territorial control. When the Ottoman government needed cash, and it always needed cash, it paid for loans with concession rights. The Baghdad Railway alone gave Deutsche Bank and its partners the right to exploit mineral resources for 20 kilometers on either side of 5,000 kilometers of trek, a corridor running straight through the most geologically promising oil territory in Mesopotamia. By 1914, French banks held the majority of Ottoman bonds outstanding. British capital controlled the Imperial Ottoman Bank, the institution that effectively functioned as the Ottoman Central Bank. German capital controlled the railway corridors. Each of these positions had been accumulated through sovereign debt arrangements made with a government that had run out of other options. The Ottoman Empire did not simply collapse under military pressure in the First World War. It had been financially hollowed out by European creditors for 40 years before the first shot was fired. While the railway diplomacy was playing out, something was happening in the Persian desert that would change the strategic calculus entirely. In 1901, a British entrepreneur named William Knox D'Arcy had negotiated one of the most extraordinary agreements in the history of natural resource extraction. In exchange for £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in shares, and a promise of 16% of future profits, D'Arcy received the exclusive right to prospect for oil across most of Persia for 60 years. The Shah received pocket change. D'Arcy received 6 decades of petroleum rights across a country whose geological potential he suspected was enormous. His geologists drilled for years and found almost nothing. His investors were failing. His backers at Burma Oil sent word to slow operations and begin packing up the equipment. The letter telling him to give up was making its way across the desert when, at 4 a.m. on May 26, 1908, at a site called Masjid-i-Suleiman, a 50-foot column of oil exploded through the drilling rig and lit up the Persian night. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born from that precise moment. The man who understood its strategic significance most clearly was Winston Churchill. In 1911, Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty. The Royal Navy was the single foundation upon which the British Empire rested, and it ran entirely on coal. Coal-powered warships were slower and less powerful than oil-burning engines could deliver. Oil-powered ships could outrun coal-powered ships, outmaneuver them, and operate at far greater range without resupply. Rival navies converting to oil would eventually be able to run circles around British coal-fired fleets. Britain had almost no domestic oil. Standard Oil controlled the American supply. Royal Dutch Shell, a Dutch and British company in which the Rothschild family held significant equity stakes, controlled much of the rest. Depending entirely on foreign commercial entities for the fuel that powered the Royal Navy was strategically untenable. Churchill pressed his case in Parliament with his characteristic certainty. In 1913, he told the House of Commons that Britain must become a controlling force at the source of its oil supply. 2 months before the First World War began, the British government purchased a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company for £2.2 million. The Parliamentary Act authorizing the purchase received royal assent less than a week before the guns of August opened fire. This was not merely a financial investment. It was a declaration of strategic intent with a specific geographic implication. Anglo-Persian's oil came from Persia, but the geology of neighboring Mesopotamia, the Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, was practically identical, and reports from surveyors have been quietly indicating enormous potential reserves for years. Mesopotamian oil was not yet in British hands. But by June 1914, Britain's new 51% stake in Anglo-Persian made acquiring access to it a matter of institutional necessity. Hold that date, June 1914, because in that same month something happened that briefly clarified exactly who was going to profit from Mesopotamian oil. And then the world went to war and scrambled everything. The arrangement that was almost finalized in June 1914 took 14 more years to complete, but the share percentages negotiated in those weeks became the template for everything that followed, and one man made sure his 5% survived every war, every diplomatic reversal, and every attempt to remove him. The borders of the modern Middle East were not the cause of the oil concession arrangements, they were the consequence of them. By 1912, a consortium of British, Dutch, and German interests had formed a company specifically to pursue Mesopotamian petroleum. It was called the Turkish Petroleum Company. Anglo-Persian held 47.5%. Royal Dutch Shell held 22.5%. Deutsche Bank held 25%. bringing its Baghdad railway mineral rights into the arrangement as its contribution to the equity. And Calouste Gulbenkian personally held 5%, a stake he had negotiated into existence through years of arrangement and leverage, and that he would defend with extraordinary tenacity for the rest of his life. On June 28, 1914, the Ottoman Grand Vizier formally promised to grant the Turkish Petroleum Company a concession to develop oil in the Baghdad and Mosul regions. 4 days later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The world went to war. The Ottoman Empire joined Germany, and the concession was suspended before it could be formalized. But the share percentages survived. The question of who owned what percentage of Mesopotamian oil had been established. The war would determine which of those shareholders ended up on the winning side, and would use that leverage to redraw the concession terms in their favor. Britain moved quickly. Before the armistice with the Ottoman Empire was even signed on October 30, 1918, British forces were already executing oil-driven territorial strategy. British troops entered the city of Mosul in the French sphere of influence under the existing Sykes-Picot Agreement on November 14, 1918. 3 days after the armistice with Germany had ended the war, the shooting had officially stopped. British forces moved into French-designated territory anyway, establishing physical facts on the ground before any peace conference could enforce the negotiated boundaries. This was not military confusion. It was deliberate territorial appropriation in service of an oil calculation. Balfour himself, addressing the prime ministers of the British dominions at this time, stated directly that Britain must be the guiding spirit in Mesopotamia. He said explicitly that he did not care under what political system Britain kept access to the oil, but that the oil needed to be available to Britain. The Foreign Secretary, the author of the Balfour Declaration, was simultaneously making clear that Mesopotamian petroleum was the primary consideration in British Middle Eastern strategy. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the secret arrangement that divided the Arab territories of the collapsing Ottoman Empire between Britain and France, is taught as a story of imperial arrogance and diplomatic cynicism. What is examined far less is the specific mechanism by which the border was drawn. Sykes later described his contribution to the boundary by saying he had simply put his pencil on a point on the Mediterranean coast and drawn a line to a point in the north. The casual description conceals a careful financial calculation. The territory Britain retained, Iraq, Palestine, the Gulf approaches, corresponded precisely to the zones where Anglo-Persian held concession interests and where British financial institutions had the deepest commercial penetration. The territory France retained, Syria, Lebanon, corresponded precisely to the zones where French banking houses had long-standing relationships and where French capital had financed infrastructure for decades. The line did not follow rivers, mountain ranges, or ethnic boundaries. It followed balance sheets. France got Syria and Lebanon because French banks had long-standing commercial relationships with the Christian merchant communities there, and because French capital had been building infrastructure in the Levant for a generation. Britain got Iraq because Mesopotamian petroleum was Anglo-Persian's primary target, and Anglo-Persian was now 51% British government property. Behind every line on that map, there was a balance sheet that somebody was reading very carefully. The Arab promises fit the same pattern. Between July 1915 and March 1916, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, wrote 10 letters to Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, effectively promising Arab independence across most of the Arabian Peninsula, Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The British needed that revolt for a specific financial reason. The Ottoman Sultan had declared jihad against the Allies, threatening to ignite the 70 million Muslims living under British rule in India, the empire's most profitable possession. The Arab revolt was not an act of British generosity. It was a transaction. Arab military cooperation purchased with territorial promises that the Sykes-Picot Agreement, being negotiated simultaneously, was already rendering meaningless. The McMahon correspondence was classified by the British government for over 20 years, not released until 1939, specifically because its contents made Britain's conduct impossible to defend in public. The promises were real enough to motivate an Arab revolt. They were never real enough to survive the oil calculations being made in the same offices at the same time. The cost of that gap was paid by a man named Faisal. He was the son of Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, who had received the British promises. Faisal commanded Arab forces through the Desert Campaign, sabotaging Ottoman railways, fighting through some of the most punishing terrain on earth. He marched into Damascus in October 1918, believing that his father's understanding with the British was about to be honored. He established an Arab government. He held elections. He began building the institutions of an independent state. In July 1920, French forces arrived. At the Battle of Maysalun, they crushed the Arab-Syrian army in a matter of hours. Faisal was expelled from the country he had fought to liberate. The Arab kingdom of Syria, which had lasted less than 2 years, was destroyed by military force. The British then installed Faisal as king of Iraq, a country he had never lived in, governing people who had not asked for him, under a constitution designed to maintain British strategic influence over Mesopotamian oil. The man who had trusted the promise was given a consolation throne over the oil fields the promise had been designed to secure. The most revealing moment in this entire story happened on a single day in April 1920 on the Italian Riviera. The San Remo Conference brought together the prime ministers of Britain, France, Italy, and Japan at a villa overlooking the Mediterranean to formalize the post-war settlement in the Middle East. The conference produced 2 documents. The first allocated the territorial mandates. Britain would govern Palestine and Iraq, France would govern Syria and Lebanon. The second was the San Remo Oil Agreement. Both documents were signed on April 24, 1920, the same conference, the same day. The territorial mandates and the oil company shareholding arrangement for Iraqi petroleum finalized simultaneously. This is not an analogy or a metaphor. It is documented history. The connection between the 2 documents was explicit. France had a claim to Mosul under the original Sykes-Picot Agreement. The province had been assigned to the French sphere of influence. British forces had physically occupied it after the armistice. At San Remo, France agreed to cede Mosul to the British mandate over Iraq. The price Britain paid for that concession was a 25% share in the successor company that would develop Mosul's oil. The borders of modern Iraq were drawn as an oil company equity negotiation. Mosul became part of Iraq because France received a 25% stake in Iraqi petroleum. The territorial concession was the price paid for the corporate share. These 2 transactions were not adjacent or coincidental. They were the same transaction expressed in 2 different documents signed on the same afternoon. Deutsche Bank's 25% stake in the Turkish Petroleum Company, representing a defeated German enemy, was transferred to the French government as a spoil of war at the same settlement. The war had functioned, among its many other horrors, as a mechanism for redistributing oil company equity from the losing powers to the winners. The American oil companies, watching all of this from across the Atlantic, were furious. The United States government argued loudly that the existing concession arrangement was legally invalid and that Mesopotamian oil should be open to international competition. Congress threatened retaliation against foreign companies whose governments excluded American interests. It took years of sustained diplomatic pressure, but by 1928, an American consortium was finally admitted to the company, which had by then renamed itself the Iraq Petroleum Company. And this is where Gulbenkian's 40 years of patient maneuvering finally produced its result. The final arrangement gave 23.75% each to Anglo-Persian, Royal Dutch Shell, Compagnie Française de Pétroles, and the American consortium. Gulbenkian retained his 5%. The stake he had negotiated in 1912, defended through a world war, 2 post-war settlements, and 16 years of legal and diplomatic pressure, was still his, intact, permanent. The entire arrangement came with a condition that would govern Middle Eastern oil development for the next 20 years. All partners agreed that none of them would independently pursue oil concessions anywhere within the former Ottoman Empire without offering the other partners the right to participate. The agreement created a cartel that covered Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and large parts of Turkey and Arabia. Gulbenkian drew the boundary of this restricted zone himself. He took a map of the Middle East, traced the old Ottoman borders from memory, and drew the line with a thick red crayon. Everything inside that line was subject to the cartel. The arrangement was not publicly disclosed. Ordinary people in Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and the rest of the region had no idea that the resources beneath their land were being managed by a secret agreement signed in a hotel in Ostend, Belgium. The agreement specifically allowed the partners to suppress production in Iraq whenever increasing output would drive down their prices in other markets. This suppression was documented and deliberate. In the years immediately following the discovery of oil at Kirkuk, in 1927, one of the largest oil fields on Earth, the Iraq Petroleum Company's partners actively constrained the pace of development. Pipelines were built slowly. Wells were capped. The Iraqi government, operating under a British mandate and then as a nominally independent state under British supervision, had minimal leverage to demand faster development. The concession terms, negotiated entirely by the extractors, gave the IPC partners the right to set the pace. A study conducted after the Second World War estimated that Iraq's oil production in the 1930s was running at approximately 10% of what the field capacity could have sustained. The other 90% was being left in the ground. Not because the technology did not exist to extract it, not because there was no market for it, but because extracting it faster would have driven down the global oil price and reduced the returns the IPC partners were receiving from there. Other fields elsewhere in the world. The oil beneath Iraq was being managed as an inventory item in a global corporate portfolio. The people of Iraq received royalties that amounted to a fraction of the actual value being extracted from their land, because the concession terms had been designed by the extractors, not by the extracted. The people of Iraq were not a consideration in that calculation. Iraq's oil was finally nationalized in 1972, 52 years after the borders of the country had been drawn as part of an oil company equity deal. 52 years during which the shareholders of the Iraq Petroleum Company extracted value from Iraqi petroleum on terms they had designed for their own benefit in a hotel in Belgium, while the people of Iraq had no seat at the table and no knowledge that the table existed. Tally what the arrangement produced. The Turkish Petroleum Company of 1912, Anglo-Persian, Shell, Deutsche Bank, Gulbenkian, became the Iraq Petroleum Company of 1928, Anglo-Persian, Shell, Compagnie Française de Pétrole, the American Consortium, Gulbenkian. The names changed. The extraction continued. The 5 partners who signed that agreement in the Ostend Hotel became, through name changes and mergers, BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Total, 4 of the largest energy corporations on Earth, still extracting oil from the region whose borders they helped design a century ago. The man who drew the line outlived the arrangement it protected. Kalusta Gulbenkian lived until 1955. He died one of the richest private individuals on Earth, with a personal fortune estimated at between $200 and $800 million. The accumulated product of 5% of every barrel of oil produced from the former Ottoman Empire across 4 decades of extraction. He never stopped defending his 5%. He was right to defend it. It was the most valuable percentage in the history of natural resource extraction. The Red Line Agreement was formally dissolved in 1948 when American pressure after the Second World War finally broke the cartel structure apart. By then, the borders it had helped to fix were the recognized international boundaries of independent states. The financial architecture had done its work. The lines were permanent. The people living inside them had inherited the consequences of decisions made in rooms they were never invited to enter, about resources they were never adequately compensated for, by men whose primary obligation was to their shareholders. The borders of the modern Middle East are not the result of ancient hatreds or inevitable religious conflict. They are the result of a set of financial decisions made between 1912 and 1928 by oil companies, banking dynasties, and governments whose primary interest was securing the most valuable natural resource on Earth before anyone else could. Behind every line on the map there was a balance sheet. Behind every concession there was a transaction. Behind the red line there was a man with a red crayon who got 5% of everything and never gave it back. That is what the ledger shows. If this is the version of history that matters to you, the one written in concession agreements and share percentages instead of the one in the textbooks, subscribe, because every video on this channel follows the money the same way. The documents are usually there. We will keep reading them together.